What's up, metalheads? Welcome to the Scrap Metal Podcast, the show for the misfits who've been listening to the same music since high school. I'm your host, John von Frankenstein, and joining me today is my metal thrashing mad co-host, Chris. Chris, I gotta ask you, man, how you feeling?
I gotta say, I am feeling extreme.
Extreme, more than words. That was a fucking alley-oop if you've ever thrown me one. Chris, does this feeling of extremities have anything to do with how you're keeping your heavy metal street cred?
It might have something to do with it.
Right,
so, as we've discussed before, between the two of us, I am the one who still kind of sort of pays attention to WWE and professional wrestling. And what I mostly pay attention to is the video games. I love playing the wrestling video games. I love all the different game modes. I love creating wrestlers and all this and that. So this year, there was a bunch of DLCs announced. I was very excited to, buy the DLCs and get all these unlockable wrestlers and all this and that. The last DLC just recently came out, so that's been really cool to see. But one of the DLCs was the ECW pack, Extreme Championship Wrestling.
Oh, shit.
And that was really cool. It introduced some new weapons, like a barbed wire baseball bat and fluorescent light tubes. So that was really cool to see in the game. It gave us the Dudley Boys, Terry Funk, CM Punk, and for the first time in who even knows how long, the Sandman was in a WWE video game. And I'm someone who I didn't really get to watch a lot of ECW when I was younger, but I knew that it was something that I loved. I knew the Sandman was really cool. And there was all of this excitement online about the fact that the Sandman was going to be in a WWE video game in 2024. Because as far as we know, he has no contact with WWE. He's not like a part of a Legends contract. He's not anyone who ever shows up on TV. So all of us fans that are a little bit older and loved ECW were very excited that the Sandman was going to be in the game. And so you had these younger fans that are like, hey, I see everyone is super excited about the Sandman. What are some classic Sandman matches I should watch? And the general consensus was, if you watch one Sandman match, you've seen them all. He was not that great of a technical wrestler. But he was very entertaining. He would come out with the kendo stick. He'd be drinking a beer, smoking a cigarette. The appeal to the Sandman was how bloody and violent his matches could be and his entrance, because he would come to the ring using Metallica's Enter Sandman. And so
there we go.
Quite possibly everyone's favorite Sandman entrance ever is at the 2006 pay-per-view ECW One Night Stand. No, the 2005 One Night Stand. That was the first One Night Stand. So they're at the Hammerstein Ballroom. Enter Sandman comes on, the crowd is singing along. He comes out through the crowd, he's drinking beers, he's pouring beers into fans' mouths. I think he pours the beer on like a woman's chest or some shit like that. Like, it's just everything that people love about ECW, and the Sandman is being represented by this one entrance that he's doing to the ring. And so it's just been really cool to see all this excitement around the Sandman. I went back and watched some Sandman matches. I used to love him as Hardcore Hack in WCW, and so I watched him and Raven have some matches, which, like, again, he wasn't that great of a technical wrestler. It was nothing but them hitting each other over the head with stop signs. But as a kid, I fucking loved it. And as an adult, I still love it. But yeah, it's been cool to have the Sandman. Unfortunately, they did not include Enter Sandman in the game, so he uses whatever generic music they had come up with when he was on WWE TV instead of Metallica's Enter Sandman.
Missed opportunity.
People were very hopeful because Metallica's, I think Lux Eterna was in last year's game. Moth into Flame, I think, was in a game. I think Sad But True has been in a game. So people were hopeful that, like, oh, maybe they'll add it, but unfortunately they didn't. But yeah, that's what I've been excited about, is the Sandman being in a video game, getting to play as the Sandman and beat the shit out of people with a kendo stick.
Dude, that's fucking awesome. That's it. It gets me so excited to think about like just the rivalries that were going on back then between all the different wrestling federations. You know what I mean? Because like WWE or back then still WWF was like the biggest fucking name.
Yeah.
And so ECW was like their, just the more extreme division?
I think so. What you had WWF, which was, where guys like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior made their name.
Yeah.
And then WCW started gaining some popularity, and Hogan and Savage went over there, and WWE started kind of changing what they were doing, but WCW took some inspiration from Japanese federations in doing a more reality-based storyline, and that's where the NWO comes in. And at the same time, you have ECW growing in Philadelphia, which was...
that makes a lot of fucking sense.
Which was, it was run out of Philadelphia by the most New Yorkers. Like, it's... Oh my God, not to go on too much of a tangent, but I rewatched an interview recently, and I forgot that all these dudes are fucking from New York and some of them from Long Island. You're talking to Paul Heyman, who's from New York, Bubba Ray Dudley, who I believe is from somewhere on Long Island, Taz, who's from Brooklyn, and Tommy Dreamer, who's from Yonkers. So you've got all these New Yorkers, and like Bubba Ray and Taz immediately go into the most stereotypical New Yorker accents when they start talking about the old days in ECW. And so it's so funny to hear them talk like that. And like, because so many wrestlers are not from New York. So it's funny to hear these dudes that are talking like they are in the mafia about ECW, which the way they were talking, the way Paul Heyman kind of handled things, it sounded like it was either being run like the mafia or they were in danger of being like hunted down by the mafia, the way they were running things. So it's a very entertaining time. But yeah, ECW was extreme, but they also they claim, I think it's true. I don't know. I'm pretty sure the first masked luchadors were introduced to American audiences through ECW. I've watched the classic Mexican death match between, I want to say it was Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis in ECW. November to Remember, 1995. They're having a classic match. Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko having classic matches in ECW. And so it was almost like ECW was bringing these people in front of American audiences. Yeah. Paul Heyman couldn't pay anyone, and Tommy Dreamer, I think, never got paid the money he was owed for all of the matches he put on and the help that he gave Paul Heyman. So you have these guys putting on great matches in front of American audiences for quite possibly the first time, but Paul Heyman can't pay them. Eric Bischoff has Ted Turner's money and pays all these guys to come to WCW. And so then that was kind of the stuff that made WCW very popular versus WWE, which still was putting like Doink the Clown out on TV. While WCW has Psychosis and Eddie Guerrero and the NWO. So that it was a very cool time to watch wrestling. It's very cool to go back and watch the wrestling from that time. And it's very cool to see people that represent that time in wrestling in today's video games and get to kind of recreate those rivalries like you were talking about. Recreate that timeline, recreate the head-to-heads. It's a lot of fun.
I love that. And I love just how excited you are about like the rivalry that was created, especially back then, versus the different wrestling federations. And it just makes me think of one of our very favorite things to do on this show, which is a head-to-head.
Yes.
That's right. Today, we're doing another one, a much anticipated, much awaited for by someone, I'm sure, head-to-head that we're doing for Black Sabbath. Now, not Black Sabbath versus another band. We're doing Ozzy versus Dio. We are putting them head to head. We're going to find out and get to the bottom of who is the greater era of Black Sabbath. Chris, I think we're going to get a little bit of hate during this episode, but it's a discussion that has to be had. It's a discussion that you're going to hear at any metal concert, at any get-together where there's any metalheads around. People are constantly going to be debating who is better, Ozzy or Dio, and that's what we're getting into today. Chris, are you excited to have this head-to-head?
I am so excited to have this head-to-head debate. Like I have often said, metalheads love to argue, and this is one of the arguments we love to have. You know, it's a classic argument, a classic debate, and there are very strong arguments on both sides for why one is better than the other, and I'm super excited to dive in. You know, it's any excuse to listen to Black Sabbath is great.
Oh, yeah.
And so this was just a lot of fun getting to hear the songs I love, maybe getting to hear some songs I haven't heard in a while or haven't heard before, but with a singer who I absolutely love. So this was a lot of fun, and I'm very excited to have this discussion.
Yeah, I feel like this discussion is going to be really different from what we've had previously. Previous head-to-heads that we've had so far are Chris Barnes versus Corpse Grinder, Cannibal Corpse, and then Van Hagar versus Van Halen.
Yep.
And I think in each one of those head-to-heads, you have your people coming to the defense of either singer. And, you know, saying like, how come you guys didn't mention this song? This is such a great song. How come you guys didn't mention that song? This is such a great song off of this album or whatever. And with Black Sabbath, I think that it is at times really easy to forget that Dio had some, you know, his time with Sabbath, because Dio is so iconic and popular on his own. But I think it's important for us to remember that his time with Black Sabbath only helped to catapult his career further than it was already. You know, he had a lot of steam rolling already from his time in Rainbow. Yeah. But I really do think that it helped him to reach a different type of audience. And so, like with any of our head-to-heads, we're going to be basing this on a couple different things. The feel of the band. What was the songwriting like with each singer? What were their vocal styles like? And just their overall presence. And I think that's probably going to be where we get a lot of the really interesting discussion. Is talking about the difference in stage presence between the two vocalists, because Ozzy and Dio, I mean, they are like just, you know, they are so incredibly iconic in their own rights and within their own careers, that the fact that we are blessed with having those two vocalists, among others, in Sabbath's roster along their time is just, it's incredible. So let's dive right into it. When we're talking about the feel of Black Sabbath, what comes to mind, like, right off the bat? Because I know I have my answer, but I want to hear what you think first.
What comes to mind when I think of Black Sabbath? I think, for me, and it's something that I might get more into, but I think for me, Black Sabbath is those old, slow riffs from the early 70s when Tony Iommi was writing these slow riffs, and, you know, Bill Ward was just playing a bluesy drum sound underneath. And you know, it was a very jazzy feel with a lot of like fuzz on the guitar, and then coming in and having Ozzy come in and scream about Satan chasing him or some shit. And like that's the Black Sabbath I love. That's the version of Black Sabbath I love. And so for me, like, Dio era Sabbath is good, but it's not the Black Sabbath that I want to listen to, because it's not the Black Sabbath I associate with being Black Sabbath. And to be quite honest, even with Ozzy, albums like Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy, those are even departures from the type of Black Sabbath I want to listen to. So it's not a surprise that Sabbath went in the direction they went in. It's not a surprise that Tony Iommi went in the directions he went in with the music. But Black Sabbath and Paranoid and Master of Reality is the shit I want to fucking hear when you say, let's listen to Black Sabbath.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because Sabbath is one of those bands that just, they were defined by, I would say, less so the vocalist and more so by Tony Iommi.
Yeah.
And where his head was at in regards to the songwriting. But where he was writing those slower proto-doom, proto-stoner riffs, he went for that more grandiose or the more dramatic, with a little bit more flair style of writing along the time that Dio had joined. So yeah, and then we see that in the albums preceding it. Yeah. So it makes sense when they go in that direction. It never felt like it was something that Dio forced upon them. Dio just fit that style better.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. When I think of Black Sabbath, it's those slower, down-tuned riffs. And it has to be said, I don't think that there's any comparison between Ozzy and Dio when it comes to just their vocal ability.
Yeah.
Elizabeth from the Charismatic Voice said something really interesting when she analyzed, I believe it was the live performance of Mr. Crowley, where she said that Ozzy just attacks a note head on. There's no real slide into a note or any real embellishments. It's kind of, you're going to deliver this line in this very straight ahead way, and it's very forward in the face. It's very nasally, and it just has this really piercing characteristic to it. Where Dio, when she analyzed Heaven and Hell, she's like, he's coming out and he's flipping his hair.
Yeah.
He's pointing at the audience, and he's getting into the drama of what it is to be a front man. And the vocal styling just he embodied that through his voice as well, where he had all of this flair and all of these vocal pyrotechnics that he was able to throw around and everything.
Yeah.
And it's a different style, and I think that thankfully each one of these guys was able to fit what the band needed at the time.
Yeah.
Where I think Sabbath was more successful than any of the either two bands that we've done on our head-to-heads before is that Sabbath consciously wrote to the vocalist. Right?
Yeah.
You talked about how in Cannibal Corpse, when Corpse Grinder started with them, they did write. They started writing in a way that is still very recognizable as Cannibal Corpse, but it was a slight departure from what they had done with Barnes. It was a little bit thrashier, a little bit punkier in the early days. Still very death metal.
Yeah.
But it was less of the brutal death metal that they're known for now with Corpse Grinder. With Van Halen, they just did the same thing. They just did the same thing and were a little bit poppier, which, again, as we analyzed in that episode, they were already headed in that direction.
Yeah.
But when you look at Black Sabbath, yes, was Tony Iommi already sort of heading in that direction somewhat, but they knew that they couldn't write for Dio in the same way that they did for Ozzy.
Yeah.
And I think that everybody, Ozzy included, knew that he was no longer going to fit in with the vision that Tony Iommi had for Black Sabbath, which, I mean, that his drug use, amongst other things, is what led to his, firing from the band.
Yeah.
But I think that that's what makes this change so you don't hear about this change in vocalists the way that you do with Van Hagar. I don't feel like there are people who just out and out hate Heaven and Hell the way that some people, myself, hate the Sammy Hagar years of Van Halen. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this debate happens, but I don't think it's because people are saying, I think it's almost the opposite. The one time I seem to remember hearing this debate happen where it's not that people hate Dio and that he replaced Ozzy. Mm-hmm. It's people trying to ardently defend that Dio is the better singer and that Ozzy is not a good singer. And all Ozzy did, which Tony Iommi said was also kind of freeing for him, is that Ozzy just sang to what the guitar riff was, Right. Whereas Dio could sing over the riff, and so it allowed Tony Iommi to write music that was going to complement Dio's singing style, which matched more of a heavy metal, like almost Judas Priest-esque type of heavy metal. Right. And, even a little bit of a power metal sound, because the band Dio was so much a power metal band. I think that's more the band Dio, but Dio's voice kind of, you can see that that's where he wanted to go. But it's like, on that Heaven and Hell album, the opening track, Neon Nights, is just like a straight ahead heavy metal riff, which Dio is phenomenal at.
Yeah.
And if you were to play that song for me and not tell me who it was and not tell me it was Black Sabbath, I don't know that I would know it was Black Sabbath.
Right.
Because it doesn't sound like the Sabbath I'm used to hearing. Mm-hmm. But a song like Heaven and Hell kind of sounds like Black Sabbath, because it kind of sounds like a slower Children of the Grave in a way.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, since this is the first album with Dio, it's like, okay, Tony Iommi has these ideas that he was working on for Ozzy, but now that Dio is here, this gives me the opportunity to do something a little bit different. And this gives me an opportunity to write something that's more of like, just like a chugging riff, instead of having to play like the notes that Ozzy is going to sing along to. I'm able to just play like this chugging riff that moves forward.
Yeah.
And Dio's voice is able to just fly over it, and it sounds awesome.
Yeah. I like that you point that out. The fact that Ozzy had his way of saying, like, okay, here's he was thinking of the riff as the outline for the vocals. So he was almost looking at it in the way that a bass player would. Like if I mean, not Geezer Butler, because Geezer Butler's a fucking maniac. He's one of the greatest bassists in all of heavy metal ever. But in the way of like, okay, this is my root note, so this is where I go, and then I'm gonna follow.
The way like a pop or pop punk or a punk bassist might look at it is that, if the way Jerry Only looks at it when Glenn Danzig writes a riff, he's like, you're playing on the 3rd fret? Well, I guess I'm playing on the 3rd fret. Oh, now you're playing on the 5th fret? I guess now I'm playing on the 5th fret. And it's, I think it goes back to something you did say, where Sabbath is Tony Iommi. And like, I know Tony Iommi, there was a point in time where when Glenn Hughes was in the band, Tony Iommi was like, no, this isn't Black Sabbath. And the record label or the producer was like, you're calling the band fucking Black Sabbath. I don't give a fuck what you want. And Tony Iommi is like, but this isn't Black Sabbath. Even Glenn Hughes is like, you want me to say I'm in Black Sabbath? Are you fucking nuts? And so that's why that, I think, 7th Star is called like Black Sabbath with Tony Iommi, or featuring Tony Iommi, because he wanted it to seem like, no, this is Tony Iommi. And so I think the way Ozzy has talked about Tony Iommi and his ability to write these heavy metal riffs and these awesome riffs. I saw a quote from Ozzy where he's like, every time you think he's run out of riffs, he hits you with something else, and it's fucking genius every single time. Yeah. And so I think early on, there might have been this attitude from Ozzy that Tony Iommi is driving the band. I'm just along for the ride, so I'm not going to try and outshine it, whether it's a conscious decision or whether it's I'm not a good enough singer to come up with my own melody type of thing. But there's almost this idea that maybe the idea was Tony Iommi has already written a riff that is a killer melody.
Right.
Who am I to try to sing something over that?
Right.
I'm just going to sing along with it. Because, like, yes, it is most prominent in a song like Iron Man, where he is just singing along to the guitar notes. But those notes are fucking sick. Yeah. You know? Yeah. So, like, why wouldn't you want to sing along to that? If Ozzy wasn't singing to it, fans would be singing along to it at the concert. So, why bother? Just sing along to it. And again, I don't know if that's the line of thinking or if it was just, hey, this is the easiest thing for me to do when I'm on every drug known to man. You know, either way, it, in my opinion, it worked. It did a great job of showcasing what everyone in the band was capable of, because it's, in a funny way, Ozzy was the least talented member of the band. Everyone else in the band was much better at what they were doing, and Ozzy was along for the ride, but his voice worked for what they were trying to do. And it was almost like Ozzy's voice represented someone who is lost in these surroundings of instruments that represents Lucifer chasing after him or whatever the fuck it is. So in a way, it works, and this is probably just me 60 years later applying modern day thoughts to what it is. But it for those reasons is why it works, and for those reasons is why the Dio stuff is great, but it's not what I want from Black Sabbath, and I think it's not what a lot of people want from Black Sabbath.
Right. It's where it's such an interesting point that you made, that Ozzy was there in service of the riff.
Yeah.
He felt that he was there in service of the riff, or sang as though he felt he was there in service of the riff. Where with Dio was going, oh, Tony has painted this incredible landscape for me to sing over. And I think it was on Heaven and Hell where they said, like, Evil Woman was one of the songs that they had tried out with Ozzy originally. Like, that album was meant for Ozzy to sing on. So they already had a demo with Ozzy singing on Evil Woman. But then when he was fired and Dio came in, he came up with something completely different. Yeah. And it was really apparent really quickly that, we are not going to be the same band with Dio, but because we have this freedom now to write in a way where he can take it off, and he has a completely different way of thinking of melody and coming up with a hook, coming up with something, his lyricism and just everything that had a completely different flair to it. Like when we talk about the songwriting, because I don't want this to become the Tony Iommi episode, as much as I love him, the musical side of it aside, when we're talking about the lyricism, these are still two vocalists who are writing about deep fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Like really crazy fantasy themes. On one hand, you've got a lot of religious fantasy, you've got a lot of, war pigs, you're talking about the horrors of war.
Yep.
And, just like fantastical things. Fairies wear boots, So some people argue what that song's actually about. And so you have these topics that Ozzy would write and sing about that were still these fantastical elements.
Yeah.
But Dio, having come from Elf and Rainbow, already talking about the man on the silver mountain, and all these sorts of things. This is like low fantasy versus high fantasy, where it's like now you're talking. We get into the territory of the holy diver, and we get into the territory of the grand wizard, and like all this. Oh wait, no, not the grand wizard.
Not that wizard. Very different wizard.
Really
not
different
that wizard.
But like I don't know, just these majestic beings that Dio would write about. And Dio still had a way of talking about evil themes, but it was more, I don't know, just even in the way he dressed, it was just more glittery, it was more glam, it was there was more flash to it. So it's just so interesting to me that Sabbath with Ozzy could be this like mallet just coming in, and everyone is playing the same, using Iron Man as an example again. Everyone is playing the same thing. The drums are locking in with the bass is locking in with the guitar riff. The vocals are locking in with the guitar riff. And then you've got a song like Mob Rules.
Yeah.
Where now you talk about how everything was swung with the way that Bill Ward would play. And then when Vinny Appice came in, where now he's playing with them. And Tony Iommi actually mentioned this about how he was also like, right, Bill used to play sort of behind the beat, relaxed, everything was swung. And now Vinny's like leading the charge and pushing everything along and driving the song forward. So again, we're not writing in the same style anymore. So with a song like Mob Rules, you get this very different, like you said, almost like a Judas Priest type.
Yeah.
The stereotypical 70s heavy metal.
Yeah.
Right? Where it has that type of sound. And it's fascinating to me that they got away with calling it Black Sabbath. It makes sense that they came back as Heaven and Hell later on, because it was its own sound. But again, I think that that's where we need to applaud Sabbath as a band. The fact that they were able to say, like, we're not going to try and dumb Dio down.
Yeah.
And force him into this peg here.
Yeah.
We're not going to pigeonhole him and force him to sing in the same way or write in the same way that Ozzy did. And we mentioned just their overall stage presence and everything too. And I don't know, I understand your point about Ozzy probably being the least talented out of everyone in the band. But I think the thing was, it was almost a blue collar way of singing, right?
Yeah.
Where like these guys, they're coming from Birmingham, England. So you're talking about these guys who have this very blue collar mindset.
Yeah.
This is my job. This is what I'm doing. I'm an entertainer. I'm a front man. That's what I'm going to do. So where Ozzy is lacking in comparison to vocal, in comparison with his vocal ability when compared to Dio, he still got up there and did his job as a front man, and he still entertained people. He got people out of their fucking seats. He hyped the rest of the band and the performances up, I think, because when you watch those early performances, he's locked on to the mic stand. He's got his hands on the microphone.
Yeah.
But anytime he's not doing that, he's headbanging and he's jumping up and down. He's clapping like that iconic Ozzy clap, which is like so cool to see. But again, because Dio had that fantasy element to him, he would come out with more of that grace and the theatrics. That's the word that I was thinking of. It's the theatrics that he would come out with that made it more of the theatrics of what you would think of as a typical showman, right?
Yeah.
I think that we have to. I still want to give Ozzy his credit because he knew what his job was and he still went out and did that.
Yeah, I think it's funny as you talk about Ozzy, and yes, I think about, like, I think it's like the Paranoid music video where his hands are glued to that mic stand and the way he's singing. But yes, I've seen the same things where he's walking around, and I think there's a part of what Ozzy is doing is Ozzy is showing he is excited about this music.
Yeah.
He loves this music. And so he's sharing that with the fans. And it makes me think of the way I've seen Anthrax with Joey Belladonna and the way he gets excited watching John Dene and Charlie and Scott and Frankie and the way they're playing. I've seen Testament where Chuck Billy takes his like half guitar, half mic stand and is like air guitaring on it in between Eric Peterson and Alex Skolnick. So that's kind of the enthusiasm that I'm thinking of that Ozzy has, is that he is enthusiastic about the music that these guys are playing because he is lucky enough to be on stage with some of the best metal musicians in the world. And he gets to sing and paint this picture for all of these fans, and he gets to have this excitement about this music. Whereas Dio is, as I'm thinking about this, it almost feels like the opposite of an observation I made about David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar.
Okay.
David Lee Roth, again, probably the least talented member in the band. But because he knew he had to keep up with the rest of the band, he himself was extremely entertaining to watch. He was up on stage doing jumping jacks, doing his splits, being as entertaining as possible. He was the entertainment because he knew his voice couldn't keep up with Eddie Van Halen's playing. So he himself needed to keep up that energy. Whereas Sammy Hagar, very good singer, can also play guitar, it was more about, no, the music is the entertainment. I'm not here to entertain you as a person. I'm here to entertain you as an entertainer. And I think Ozzy and Dio are almost the opposite, where Ozzy is like, I'm just here to say some words and have some fun. Whereas Dio is like, no, I am here to bring you on an adventure. I'm going to bring you on this adventure, and we're on this adventure together, and I'm going to acknowledge the fans, and I'm going to point to the crowd, and I'm going to wave my arms around and show you just how epic this music is, because it is. Yeah. And so it's almost the opposite of what happened in Van Halen, where you had one singer. The original singer was mostly just focused on saying the right words and conveying the right sound within his range. And the other was very much about like, no, I want to entertain you not just as a singer, but as a front man. And I want to make this an exciting experience for everyone.
It's so funny to me. And just probably because of what we mentioned at the top of the episode, when you think of Black Sabbath, you think of the Ozzy years. You think of those songs. When someone says, what's your favorite Black Sabbath song? I don't think I've ever heard anyone say Heaven and Hell.
Yeah.
That's a great fucking song. It's a phenomenal song. Their live performance of that, again, covered by Elizabeth from the Charismatic Voice, is just incredible to watch and incredible to witness. But what you think of when you think of Black Sabbath are these songs with Ozzy.
Yep.
You know, Symptom of the Universe, Into the Void.
Yeah.
You know, these songs, Children of the Grave, these songs are so hard-hitting and so cemented in what we think of as Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
That it's so tough. I think that this is one of the toughest head-to-heads that we've ever done, because both of these singers are phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I don't have an argument for one versus the other. not quite as feverishly as I have in prior episodes, in prior head-to-heads. But I grew up with the Heaven and Hell album at home, and I never listened to it because I was like, I don't know. I knew all the album covers with Ozzy.
Yeah.
I didn't know this album cover. And I'm like, what is this? And my dad's like, oh, that's Black Sabbath. I'm like, but I've never heard of this album. He's like, oh, it's with a different singer. So, or I don't know if he told me if it was with a different singer or if he said Dio, you know, out and out. But I know that we had that album when I was a kid. And we had the Black Sabbath reunion live with like the two dragon twins.
Yeah.
With like that metal shield on the cover. I had that CD, and I had Heaven and Hell, and I would only ever listen to the Black Sabbath live reunion concert because those were the songs that I thought of. And I think it's probably part of the reason why I grew up not a fan of Dio. So like, I grew up not really liking Dio. I didn't get the whole fantasy thing. I didn't get Holy Diver. Like, I did not understand the hype. It wasn't until after he passed and seeing everybody talk about how iconic he was. So now imagine, he passed in what, 2009, 2010? We were still in college.
I think it was 2010. Because I know the Heaven and Hell album, the band Heaven and Hell, came out with their album, I believe, in 2009, and it was either later that year or the following year that Dio passed away. Because I think it interrupted their like world tour plans and plans for more albums and everything. So
this is gonna interrupt the tour.
This is gonna ruin the tour. What tour? The world tour. I forget the guy's name, but he's a Long Island legend.
Oh boy.
That's a dated that's a dated reference when we're referencing it when we record. By the time this episode airs, that reference is going to be ancient.
Oh man. So I'm such a fucking goofball. Did you see my face as soon as you fucking said it? I couldn't even hold it in. I was like, uh-oh. Oh, man. But yeah, I did not grow up as a fan of Dio. And so after he passed, in seeing everyone talk about how incredible and how iconic he was, I finally gave him a shot. And it didn't happen in the way that it did with like Van Hagar, where I was listening to it and I was like, he's trying. If he was trying to be Ozzy, which he never would have, you know what I mean? Like now that I have such a love for Dio and his music, I don't think that he ever would have just said like, okay, I'll do what Oz was doing.
Yeah.
But just like giving it a chance. Whereas with Van Hagar, I was like, I don't like this because I just get Dave back in the band. Like I think I made the comparison where like Sammy Hagar is your stepdad trying to be cool and trying to get you to like him. And you're like, no, fuck off. Dio was his own entity. And sure, does that make it something that should have been separate from Black Sabbath? Yeah, in a way, I think Black Sabbath acknowledged that as well by reuniting with him under the name Heaven and Hell, as opposed to just getting back together as Black Sabbath. But it was so enlightening, and I was so much more open to listening to the Dio years because it's so different. I didn't feel like I was forcing myself to like Black Sabbath with a different singer. It felt like they were a different band because they were approaching the songwriting differently, because Tony Iommi felt freer. He knew that Dio would be able to figure out how to craft a melody over this particular riff. You know what I mean? Where he probably didn't feel that way with Ozzy. And I don't even know that it was necessarily a conscious thought. It's probably just an interesting stamp on where his songwriting was at the time, or where his mind was at the time. But yeah, it's so difficult to make the case where like in prior head-to-heads, I'm like, nah, fuck this whole entire era. And even when you go to like Dehumanizer, right? Like, those songs fucking rip.
Yeah.
But to your point, it's not the Black Sabbath that you think of. It's really fucking great, you know? We have done another prior episode, how could I forget, with Andy from the Roy's Review podcast on Maiden versus Judas Priest. And he went on an entire rant, 3 hours of it that I had to cut out from the show, about how Dio is the better singer. And that's the thing is, yes, he is the better technical singer. He is the better singer and songwriter out of the two. I think it's just a matter of, no matter how good Dio is, the Ozzy years had all of the earworms or all of the iconic songs that people think of when they think of Black Sabbath. In the way that, like, if I throw on Hammer Smashed Face, right?
Yep.
People are going to fucking lose it. If I throw on Running with the Devil, people are going to lose it. And if you throw on War Pigs, or Black Sabbath, people are absolutely going to lose it.
Yeah.
Where you throw on one of their songs from the Dio era, and it becomes like a really introspective thing. This entire conversation starts when you play something from the Dio years. The entire conversation of, who do you think is the better singer?
Yeah.
Who do you think is the better, who do you think made for a better band? And it's Dio gifted us with this discussion that will go on until quite literally the end of time.
Yes.
You know what I mean? This feels really different from other head-to-heads. Do you agree? I don't feel like we're battling each other, trying to convince each other of anything here.
Yeah, I think, for me, I actually feel like this lands somewhere in the middle of our other two lead singer head-to-heads.
Okay.
Barnes versus Corpse Grinder, very similar to, Ozzy versus Dio, I think is similar to Barnes versus Corpse Grinder in that all of Cannibal Corpse's best songs were written while Barnes was in the band. All of Black Sabbath's best songs were written while Ozzy was in the band. But for me, I know your opinion is vastly different, but for me, when it comes to Van Halen, while I do prefer the stuff with David Lee Roth, I'm also a big fan of the stuff that they did with Sammy Hagar.
Right.
So
Right.
I understand why someone would pit those two against each other because they are different, and in some ways it sounded like Hagar was just trying to be David Lee Roth, and other times it felt like Van Halen was going in a different direction. I still liked that stuff. With Black Sabbath, 100%, I believe that the best songs were written while Ozzy was in the band, like I think with Cannibal Corpse. But unlike Cannibal Corpse, or I don't know, but I am more willing to say Dio is the much better lead singer than Ozzy than I am to say that Corpse Grinder is better than Barnes. And similar to Van Halen, it is easier for me to not make the distinction between Van Halen and Van Hagar because I do like a lot of music from both. Whereas with Black Sabbath, while I do think Dio's a better lead singer, I would much rather listen to Ozzy era Sabbath, or if I'm gonna listen to Dio, I'll just listen to Rainbow or Dio. I don't necessarily want to listen to Black Sabbath era Dio because it's almost like by calling it Black Sabbath, it makes me not want to listen to it. You call it literally anything else, I'll listen to it. But because it's being called Black Sabbath and it's not some doom riff that's being played like the blues, and it's instead just Judas Priest with Dio instead of Rob Halford, like it's good, but it's not Black Sabbath. And so I think that's why it's hard for me to make that distinction. And it's funny you bring up Andy. It was Andy who I remember in your backyard going on the rant, which apparently I guess he just does that all the time, but going on the rant about how Ozzy, just sings the same notes, Dio can actually sing, and it's
you know what? And to Andy's credit, sorry to cut you off, but to Andy's credit, he brought up an incredible point where they crafted actual songs with Dio.
Yeah.
Whereas with Ozzy, it was the one riff, and then they had like another cool bridge riff that would never go anywhere. And then they would just go back to the original riff. But it's because it was all about the riff.
Yeah.
It was all about the riff. And like we said, Ozzy was there in service of the riff, where Tony Iommi was writing and crafting whole entire songs with Dio. So yeah, it's and I agree with you. It's if you call it by any other name, it's going to feel a little easier to get into. And yeah, you can just listen to Dio's solo stuff. Or his material with Rainbow, and it's all just as good.
Yeah.
The thing is it Black Sabbath? And that's the big question. Is it Black Sabbath? And who do you think is the more important singer to Black Sabbath's history? I know your answer already, but I still think that had they never had the Dio years, I don't think that they would have circled back to saying, hey, let's get back to basics and get back together with Ozzy.
Yeah.
As an idealist, I am taking away factors like money to say that I'd like to think that Sabbath went, wow, this was a really special thing. Like, we look at what we did with Dio. Look at what we did with Glenn Hughes.
Yeah.
But look at how iconic those songs with Ozzy are. And so that's what gave us that Black Sabbath reunion concert CD that I used to just stare at as a kid and listen to over and over and over and over and over again. It's the album 13. I think that's a great fucking album. I love that album. And I wonder if they ever would have even entertained getting back together with Ozzy had they not had those Dio years. So for that reason, I will say that Dio might be the more important singer in their trajectory. Maybe not in terms of creating the iconic songs and the songs that will jump out at you immediately when you think of the name Black Sabbath, but we had to have Dio in order to get the reunion. Do you get what I mean?
I do understand what you're saying. I get what you're saying. And
you're completely wrong, but I get what you're saying.
Well, it makes me think of a few different things because I did read a number of different things about what Ozzy and Tony Iommi and Dio and Glenn Hughes have all said about their time in the band and each other in the band. And it makes me think of a couple things. It briefly reminds me of how Exodus reunited with Paul Bailoff, and he then unfortunately passed away, and it was Zetro who came back in to do Tempo of the Damned. Otherwise, that would have been Paul Bailoff on that album, and how that trajectory would have been interesting. But with Sabbath, from what I remember reading, and I don't have the years in front of me, and I don't remember the exact years everything happened, but I know that, Heaven and Hell is in 1980, Mob Rules is like 81 or 82, something like that. And then you get like Ian Gillan and Glenn Hughes are in there. And then, and then Dio comes back for Dehumanizer in the early 90s, I believe 92. And I want to say that it was the tour for that Ozzy was having his No More Tours tour, where he was going to retire. And I don't know who reached out to who, but Tony Iommi says to Dio, Black Sabbath is going to play the last two shows of Ozzy's. We're going to open for Ozzy on his last two shows of this No More Tours tour. And Dio didn't like that because he knew that if they got together, they were going to reunite and he wasn't going to be in the band anymore. So Rob Halford actually sang for those two shows. Dio didn't even perform with the band at those two shows. And so the way I would look at it and would counter your argument is that if as a band, Tony Iommi, and I don't remember if, I think Geezer Butler was still a part of it. I don't remember if Bill Ward was still a part of it. I don't remember who was still part of the band at that time. I know there was times where it seemed like Tony Iommi kind of wished he could have saved the Black Sabbath name for only when it was those four original members. Like I said, he didn't want to call the Glenn Hughes, version Black Sabbath. If they weren't still a band, if Ozzy was the only one who was still going and Tony and Geezer and Ward were not touring as a band or not doing anything musically, would they have still had a desire to honor Ozzy by playing with him at his last shows? And so I think the fact that Tony Iommi at times seemed to want to save the Black Sabbath name for when it was really Black Sabbath, I think there's a part of him that if he hadn't been creating music as Black Sabbath for the, 13-ish years since Ozzy was, kicked out of the band, would he have still had a desire to, let's play with Ozzy. Ozzy is calling it quits, which obviously didn't stick, much like Kiss, But would he have still had that desire to be like, Ozzy was the singer when Black Sabbath became Black Sabbath, the first heavy metal band, the greatest heavy metal band, the heavy metal band that anyone who listens or plays metal has, it's impossible to not say that this band influenced you in some way. How can you not be like, let's do this one more time? If Ozzy is calling it quits, and at the time it seemed like he really was calling it quits, he was ready to retire, he was ready to stop touring, he was ready to stop creating music, let's give these fans something special and reunite Black Sabbath one more time so that everyone can listen to it and hear these songs live one more time. So again, I get what you're saying. Does Dio being there mean that we don't get that reunion? Or if we don't get those albums between Never Say Die and the reunion, do they still reunite simply because Tony Iommi thinks it would be a cool thing to do for Ozzy's last tour? It's a fun what if, and it's a fun discussion to have. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to argue and debate and have these fun head-to-heads.
Yeah, it's the alternate universe Black Sabbath history that we're talking about. So, Chris, I have to ask, does this leave us with our very first lead singer head-to-head stalemate? Are we declaring this a just a tie?
I think there is a argument to be made that it is a stalemate. Mm-hmm. But I think at that point, you have to decide what are you using to compare the two.
Right.
Does Dio's ability to be quite possibly the greatest lead singer in heavy metal history outweigh the fact that all of the best songs were written while Ozzy was in the band and Ozzy sang on all of those songs? And I think that's why it's hard for me to say that this is a stalemate, because while I love Ronnie James Dio with all my heart, if I'm going to listen to Black Sabbath, at no point am I ever going to say, you know what I really want to hear? TV Crimes off of Dehumanizer. No, I want to hear Children of the Grave every single fucking time. Yeah. I want to hear The Wizard. I want to hear Ozzy play that harmonica. All right? That's what I want. So again, an argument can be made, but I just don't think that being the absolute greatest completely outweighs the fact that the best fucking music was written while someone else was in the band.
All right, Chris, now that we're friends again, can you give us your suggestion for this week, please?
So my suggestion for this week, I know I just gave an impassioned speech about why Ozzy is the preferred version of Black Sabbath that I will listen to, but my suggestion is the band Heaven and Hell and their one album, The Devil You Know. This is, as we said, essentially Black Sabbath with Dio. Like Tony Iommi wishes, it is under a different name. It is not considered Black Sabbath, even though we all know it is.
Right.
And what I find so interesting about this album is that one of the tracks, maybe the opening track, is called Adam and Evil, which right away, awesome fucking song title. I loved the song based on the title alone. And so I listened to it. And like we've said, the Heaven and Hell album, the first song, Neon Nights, is a straight-ahead heavy metal song. It is everything that you expect Ronnie James Dio to be singing over. Right. And I listened to Adam and Evil, and it is the slow doom metal sound of early Black Sabbath with Ozzy. And I fully expected this to be just the straight-ahead heavy metal. And instead, it sounded even more like Black Sabbath, like Ozzy-era Black Sabbath, than even the song Heaven and Hell sounds like. So I definitely suggest you check this out, because I think this is a perfect representation of what I think Black Sabbath could have potentially been in 1980 if Tony Iommi didn't, I guess, almost in a way, feel free to try something new. This almost felt like Tony Iommi being like, no, I'm going to write some slow, sick fucking riffs, and we're going to get the greatest singer in heavy metal history to sing over it. And they put out this one album, like I said. The song Adam and Evil is great. The song Fear is also really good, and it's the same thing where it sounds like War Pigs. It sounds like Black Sabbath, but it's in 2009, and it's Ronnie James Dio singing over it. So that's why my suggestion is the band Heaven and Hell and their only album, The Devil You Know.
That's an awesome suggestion. I've got to go back and listen to like the full Heaven and Hell album.
Yeah.
Because that's I remember when that had come out, and I was like, oh shit. Like, again, this is before I had an appreciation for Dio. And I was like, Sabbath, but it's actually with Dio. Like, what the hell are they doing? And it's not even, it's a completely different band. Like, what's even the point? And now you've gotten me excited about it. So I have to give credit where credit is due. I got this suggestion by way of Andy from the Roy's Review podcast, our former guest on the show. I can't believe I forgot that we had done the Maiden versus Judas Priest episode with him. My God, I apologize, sir. But I want to suggest a band and a song that he actually brought to me. So during one of those famous barbecue talks where we're sitting outside listening to heavy metal and forcing the neighbors to listen to it as well, he showed me the band Slow Mosa and their song There Is Nothing New Under the Sun. This has a very cool stoner rock sort of proto stoner metal, proto doom type of early Black Sabbath sound, and this entire album is really, really fun. If you like that slower doom metal type of stuff, if you like the earlier era Black Sabbath type of sound and bands that adopt that and just kind of make it their whole entire shtick, check out the band Slow Mosa and their song There Is Nothing New Under the Sun. Thanks for tuning into the Scrap Metal Podcast. The time has come for us to pack up our gear, but we'll be back to rock out with you in the next episode.
Stay metal, everyone.
Good night.